Mr. Anderson?
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, once again, let me reintroduce myself. I'm Chris Anderson. I am Mr. Hayes' second lawyer. You'll recall that at the beginning of the trial, when we were doing jury selection, I introduced myself and indicated that I probably wouldn't have much chance to talk to you unless and until the circumstances of you finding Mr. Hayes guilty of murder should occur. And then at that point, I would come into play exactly as I am now for this sentencing phase of the trial. You've rendered a fair verdict. We thank you for your patience and your hard work. You spent a lot of time deliberating, and we accept your decisions. And let me assure all of you that we all know that all killings are tragic. Nothing that I say to you and present to you today is meant to diminish the value of human life. You've heard talk about the victims being prostitutes. They still had value. They were human beings. It would be hypocrisy for me to try to downplay their significance and then beg for mercy for Mr. Hayes at the same time. All human life has value, and you need, in the difficult task of deciding whether to sentence Mr. Hayes to life or death, you need all the information, and we're going to give it to you. We want you to have confidence in your decision. You recall that during jury selection, I asked if you would all consider certain types of evidence that we're going to present. And I'm going to go over the kinds of things that you're about to be shown just to give you a preview. But it was very important that we would get jurors that would consider not only a death sentence, but also consider a life sentence. It was very important that we got jurors that would consider the things that we're going to present as what's called mitigation. And mitigation simply means things that lessen or weigh against the death penalty. And mitigation can be anything. It can be a hardship, a virtue, a good deed, anything. And you're going to see a wide variety of mitigation in this case. And I'm going to go over a little of what we're about to show you. You're going to hear evidence that Mr. Hayes was raised without a father figure in his life after his own dad was murdered. You're going to hear evidence that his mother had to work full-time to support the family. You're going to hear evidence that Mr. Hayes was a gifted student as a young man, but there weren't the school facilities to deal with kids that were ahead of the other pupils. And as a consequence, he tended to get into some mischief in school. You're going to hear evidence that he played a musical instrument. Playing a musical instrument or reciting poetry, any kind of performance is not done for the performer. It's done for the viewer. You're going to hear evidence of that kind of giving, skill, and act. You're going to hear evidence that Mr. Hayes was gainfully employed, always working, even though something was amiss and he had trouble hanging on to jobs. A continual string of changing work. Mr. Hayes, you will hear, had a caring and hardworking but detached mother who of necessity had to run a household as a very strict disciplinarian, and sometimes that discipline crossed the line into abuse. You're going to hear evidence that Mr. Hayes, despite his problems, strived to support his family financially, support his kids. And of course, childhood shapes who we become as adults, and you're going to hear evidence that Mr. Hayes was overweight as a child for a while and got bullied and had to fight in a rough, gang-infested area. You're going to hear evidence that Mr. Hayes' biggest way of contributing was cooking for others. Again, preparing meals, something done for others, for the enjoyment and pleasure of others, family and friends. You're going to hear evidence that despite his challenges, he tried to better himself, even to the point of going to college and earning a degree. You're going to hear evidence that Robert was abused as a child, sexually. And yet, despite those things, you're also going to hear that he was a loving son, a loving brother, and he was an involved and active family member. You're going to hear evidence that he behaved appropriately around children and around women in normal social circumstances. You're going to hear that he was actually, in ordinary circumstances, a peaceful and non-violent individual who was a good listener and there for others. You're going to also hear evidence that he had a strong sex drive that for him was a problem to the point where he was resorting to prostitutes for sex. You're going to hear that he treated the mothers of his children appropriately, and that he controlled his temper, and he was peaceful in ordinary circumstances. You're going to also hear that the fact that Mr. Hayes is a very large, imposing man has sometimes given him some resistance from other people. They become afraid of him because of his size, and that affects him. And you're also going to hear that he was helpful, reverent, friendly, and loyal. He also had a sense of humor. You're going to hear about that. He liked to get other people laughing and feeling good and happy. You're going to hear evidence that he always treated others with respect in ordinary circumstances. You're also going to hear that he was brave and courageous, even to the point of sticking around and making sure that one lady he knew was safe when somebody tried to bust down his door, some frenzied stranger. So you're going to hear all of these things. And all of these are things that you consider in deciding between life and the death penalty. You're going to hear that Robert Hayes is not all bad. You're going to hear evidence that will convince you that he has committed these crimes, but there's another side to him that takes him out of that group of people that should be sentenced to death. Remember, we talked about this earlier, Florida is not a death penalty state. It is a life or death state. And this is a tough decision to make, and it wouldn't be fair to ask you to make that decision without giving you all the facts, and we're going to give them to you today. You're going to hear what's called victim impact statements. These are statements by people, friends and family of the ladies who were killed that talk about these victims' uniqueness as individuals and their value to the community. And it's important because, as I've said before, all lives are important. And it's only fair that you also consider the fact that these killings have caused a loss. We're not downplaying the significance of these homicides. They're very serious. And so too is your life or death decision. The mitigation evidence that we're about to present will show you that Mr. Hayes had a difficult childhood. He had a problem, He had problems especially holding jobs. And the mental health expert testimony that you're about to hear today will demonstrate to you that Mr. Hayes had a single set of mental health impairments that would manifest themselves in these violent acts of women. In other words, there's a non-choice aspect of this, the fact that he has mental impairments that are crucial to understanding what happened in these 3 homicides. Now, the state is going to present evidence and argument to attempt to persuade you that the murders were cold, calculated, and premeditated. And you've already heard the evidence about the murders, but I believe that as the second half of the trial progresses, you will even more firmly believe than you probably believe right now that these murders were definitely not something ordinarily contemplated and pre-planned and carried out in a cold, calculated way. Whatever they were, frenzied, spontaneous, an outburst, they were anything but a carefully planned, cold, calculated set of murders. You're going to hear some brain scan expert testimony, and you will be pointed out physically the problems with Mr. Hayes' brain and how those problems dovetail in and help us understand what happened. Very important evidence, even though it'll be a little dry at times. And again, I ask you to pay close attention to all the mitigation that I put on in this case. Although as Judge Zambrano instructed you, the state has to prove the aggravating factors in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. Mitigators, you only need to be convinced by the greater weight of the evidence that they exist. In other words, if you believe even just a small bit that these mitigators exist or have been proven, then the next question you have is how much weight to give to each mitigating factor. And these mitigating factors are weighed by each of you individually. In other words, as Judge Zambrano instructed you, your decision as to aggravating factors must be unanimous. Your decision, if this case should unfortunately end this way, to impose the death penalty must be unanimous. But your decisions as to which of the mitigators matter and how much each one matters is individual. You don't have to agree on that. That's an individual decision, and you all apply your own experience, your own judgment, your own perspective to. That's why we have 12 jurors, not just one person deciding this case. You all matter. Some of the expert testimony is going to get a little dry. If it does, if we start losing anybody, if it's getting hard to stay awake, please let the judge know you need a break to stretch your feet, whatever, because it's critical. Because when this case is over with, and when you're driving down the I-95 or down Speedway or Granada Boulevard or any of the other major thoroughfares late at night, you will be thinking about this case. You will think about this case and what you did here today for the rest of your lives. And you want to have the confidence to say to yourself, I did follow all the steps. I did listen to all the mitigation. I did consider all of it. You do that and you've done your job right and you've got that confidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The state, you may proceed.